Hi there. Thanks for tuning in to the SEI Cultivating Connections podcast, where we highlight creative initiatives that bring communities together, as well as strategies that you can use to build bridges across differences. I'm David Crowley, founder of SEI and the host of this podcast. Today, I'll be chatting with Sam Pressler. Sam is a practitioner fellow at the University of Virginia's Karsh Institute of Democracy, a research affiliate at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, and author of Connective Tissue, a framework for regenerating connection in American communities. In his past life, he founded and led the Armed Services Arts Partnership, America's largest community arts organization serving veterans and their families. Good morning, Sam. Welcome to the Cultivating Connections podcast.
Good morning.
Looking forward to digging into this topic of how we increase social connection. And you've done some really deep and exciting work on this with your connective tissue framework. So before we delve into the detail, as tempting as it is, I do want to hear a little bit about your backstory. What about your personal journey leads you to be interested in focusing so much on this topic?
It's always interesting to figure out where to share, what parts of the story to share, especially when you're talking about like things like connection and community, because in some ways it kind of feels like everything. Where I would maybe center this conversation is my experience, what I would say is like accidentally starting the Armed Services Arts Partnership, or ASAP, which is now the largest community arts organization in the country serving veterans, service members, and their families. I basically started it while I was a 20-year-old at William Mary, just wanting to do a stand-up comedy class for veterans, because humor was how I cope with hard times. Humor was how I connected with people, and wanted to, bring humor in the service of service, so to speak. And the beautiful thing about that was I was quite naive and didn't know what I didn't know, and just did it. And it was one of these like kind of incredible experiences where the class very much was the first class we hosted was kind of oversubscribed, and then after the class people wanted to continue to engage with fellow veterans, continue to engage in the arts. And one thing led to the next, where by the time I was graduating from college, we had built this whole community arts organization out of William Mary, serving the Hampton Roads area. And then I was very fortunate to get an Echoing Green fellowship right after I graduated, and build out this national nonprofit. And there's a million things I could say about that time with ASAP, but I think the thing that really grounded me in like the power of community and the power of connection was seeing this group of people who, with the exception of having this identity of veteran, which really is just this shared experience of military service,
Right.
were as diverse and different as you can imagine, by age, by race, by education, by geography, by political identity. And seeing a group of people who didn't know each other on the front of a 8-week class, let's say, by the end feeling like they have this trust and connection, and that they're willing to support each other, not just inside of the classroom or inside of the community, but in all of these ways outside of it, in terms of, taking someone to the hospital if they were sick, visiting, in a time of need, going to a family member's funeral, like this kind of, there was this indescribable almost magic of community. And when I handed that organization off to a new executive director, I think for me, I was just trying to like unpack what the heck happened there, right? Like I
Wow.
was a civilian, I wasn't an artist, and I was now running the largest military arts organization in the country, and I was really energized by and passionate about it. And so a lot of my what's followed since has been oriented around the question of like, oh, like the thing underneath the thing is, how do we connect or reconnect people to the communities, the commitments, the connections that make our lives worth living, that give our lives meaning. And so that's kind of was very much the formative experience for me.
Oh, that's very interesting to hear. I mean, we could go down a whole nother tangent around, that sort of social entrepreneur aspect of, just, being at that stage where you just take something on. But that's not today's conversation. But I love
Yeah.
the way you are able to distill from that experience that underlying value of the connection. And, it's interesting too, because I can imagine those service members had that in the service, had, of course, that strong, from very different backgrounds, of course, I've heard many veterans talk about how that's such an experience of, coming together, people from all over the country, all kinds of backgrounds, but then come back to today's America, that's not,
Yeah.
it's kind of probably the opposite. So I could see how the kind of hunger for it. I don't know if anybody
Yeah.
ever kind of articulated it that way to it all, or.
Well, I mean, that is the thesis of Sebastian Junger's tribe, which
Hmm,
is, the way I would describe it is you at once, when you're in the military, and this is not for everyone, everyone has a different experience of the military, but in general, you have this strong sense of mission and purpose. You have this strong sense of belonging. You have this strong sense of identity of being a soldier, or a Marine, or an airman. And you have very tangible skills that you're contributing to the mission. And not only do you leave the military, have that transition, and kind of almost in a very short period of time lose those things, but you're also entering a community that, as I'm sure you talk a lot about in this podcast, has simultaneously we've been seeing the institutions that provide belonging in life, that provide meaning in life, that provide a sense of kind of usefulness with your skills deteriorating, whether it be kind of civic life that Putnam talks about, church, unions, family life. Um, and as a result, it makes that transition period even more accentuated and even more difficult.
right, right. And you've started anticipating my next question about sort of key drivers of this social disconnection. But so you've talked about institutions, but is there a thing under the thing, as to pick up your phrase before, that's, that you see as sort of the underlying factor or key factors?
This is always an interesting question to answer. I'm sure you
Hmm.
get it sometimes when
Yeah,
people ask
yeah,
you as well, right? Because it's uh, the way I described in the policy framework that I wrote is that like you have this kind of interconnected, dynamic set of changes that have occurred that are kind of compounding upon one another.
right,
Um,
right.
and to pinpoint one single thing as the driver is almost like playing a game of whack-a-mole. Like all these things go
Right.
together. Uh, without like what I can say is like in the post, if we just look at the timeline from post mid 20th century, which is an abbreviated timeline, and I think there are a lot of other things that happened before that. But if we just look at from that point in time, um, as a frame of reference, I think you can look at a few different things that have happened. First is kind of these deterioration of these institutions
Right.
that promoted stability and structure in life, but also promoted meaning, belonging, connection. So, like I said, religion, the kind of decline of religious affiliation, participation, the decline of kind of civic group participation, like your Rotaries and your Lions clubs and your YMCA's, the decline of union membership, particularly private sector union membership, which was more
Mm-hmm.
serving working class folks. The acute decline of marriage, particularly among people without college degrees, um, like all of those things independently and then together were like these structures of stability, and these structures of belonging. And you could kind of think about like when you're a member of a religious congregation, it's not just that you're a member of that group and you go on Saturdays or Sundays or whenever you go, you're then getting invited into more groups and you're continually
Mm-hmm.
deepening your participation. What that has occurred, and then in that void, what's replaced it has had much higher barriers to entry, whether that be economically speaking, like or financially speaking, geographically speaking, or culturally speaking. And so the kind of current stage of civic life is oftentimes these organizations that I describe as like very pay to play, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have to pay $100 a month for this workout class or like
Yep.
this community arts class. Those may often be located in higher income places. And so what we've seen happen is that overall, kind of this participation in civic life and kind of connection in civic life is down, but is most acutely down for people without college degrees, lower income people, because of these, in part because of these higher barriers of entry. There's a ton
Mm-hmm.
of other stuff going on too, right? Like,
Right.
and I'm not even talking about, we could talk about the change in our technological ecosystem. Like Putnam was the one who said the introduction of television
Right. Yeah.
is what like contributed to the decline of civic life. Well, now we have smartphones and we have internet and we have streaming services, like all these things that are very much competing directly for our leisure time, which is the time we would be spending with other people in community. We have kind of a rise in precarious work, in work that is has less stable schedules, less predictability over the schedules, which not only makes planning to spend time with family or community more difficult if you don't know your schedule in the week, but it also taxes your social support network when your schedule is getting changed and you might need to kind
True.
of draw on them more. And so we have a lot of changes to the very structural reality of our experiences that for the most part are pushing us in the direction of kind of civic decline and disconnection, and particularly acute among folks who don't have degrees and lower income people.
Yeah. Yeah, that all makes sense, and it's hard to pick one of those. It's interesting. You really hit a couple times the point about how it's really impacting uh, the really the class difference here in
Mhm.
terms of how this is landing, which is interesting because certainly, certainly our world, we sometimes think about the implications of like we do part of our programming involves young people. So when we think
Mhm.
about them needing more social capital, more access to opportunity, but you're, if you want to say a little more about the data, I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit more about, how that's playing out, and maybe it's just that direct tie of the in a growing inequality that's driving it, or a little bit more why it's landing a little
Yeah,
bit more
so
in the.
so I just put out a decently large report with the Survey Center on American Life and the guy who runs that there, Daniel Cox, which is called Disconnected: The Growing Class Divide in American Civic
Oh,
Life.
cool.
And what we saw in that data, the way I would describe this is like we tracked all the way from like the front end, so civic opportunity, the supply side of social capital and communities, like your access to places like libraries and parks and private third places like cafes and coffee shops and restaurants, through to the kind of participation and membership in groups. So do you participate in community groups? Do you participate in religious groups? Do you participate in unions? Through to then friendships, which like I think is like, if participation is the how, friendship is like kind of who you meet
Yeah.
partially through that experience, and then all the way to social support, which in some ways is the so what, right? Like if we have this friendship, if we have these connections, we receive this social support. And what we saw across the board, this is not I don't want to say this is a causal argument, but it's clearly a sequential argument, is that time and again, people without college degrees, the education line was the dividing line, have less access and to civic opportunities, whether it be parks and libraries, like public free things, or more private things like gyms and cafes and coffee shops. They participate and are members of community groups, religious groups, unions at much lower rates. They have significantly fewer friends. The kind of jaw-dropping piece of data in that was that in 1990, 2% of people with college degrees and 3% of people without college degrees reported having no close friends. In
Mm.
2024, 10% of people with college degrees reported having no close friends, but 24% of people without college degrees reported
Wow.
having no close friends. And when you look at Black Americans without degrees, it's 35% of Black Americans without degrees reporting having no close friends.
That's a huge number.
And
Jeez.
so it's like that's worth thinking about. Like, what is the texture of the experience of life when you feel like you have no close friends, right? Like, how does that, just your day to day? What does that feel like? And I think, and so that then translates into the social support data, where we see very similar trends, where it's people with college degrees have, for lots of different things, have many um, people that they can tap into, whether it's to get loaned $200 to get a place to stay if you need a place to stay, to have someone care for your child, to have someone listen to you if you have problems, right? To have someone help you find a job. Deeper networks if you have a college degree. Whereas if you don't have a college degree, oftentimes people either have one person they can turn to or
Hmm.
no people that they can turn to
Right.
for those things. And then when you think about like this is like the very tangible so what is like, if 20% plus people without college degrees have no one to turn to when they're left, when they lose housing. Well,
Hmm.
that's the difference between being
Yeah.
like on the streets or not. And
Yeah.
so the takeaway from this data, I think the loneliness discourse has gone in a very individualized
Mm,
direction, where we
mhm.
kind of say, oh, you're lonely, therefore you should make friends. You're lonely, therefore you should find a third place. But really, if you look at this data, it is a structural problem. It
Right.
is something that is the result of changes to our policy, to changes to our institutions, and to changes to our culture that has left one group of people, frankly, alone or on their own, and then has left another group of people with much richer civic, relational, and support, lives of social support. And so that is kind of the texture of this that we're discussing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, you're doing a great job anticipating questions because I think, I was going to get into, before we get into some of the specifics and the connective tissue framework, it is ultimately, talking about policy. And, yeah, I think you've um, teed up a little bit what you might want to say, but maybe if you want to elaborate, why did you take this approach of really focusing on, addressing social connection at a through a policy, or at least in part through policy?
Yeah. So I start by saying I actually don't think policy is the driver of kind of strengthening connection in American life. I think the only reason we're even having a conversation right now where policy is on the table as an intervention is because there's been a set of change kind of culturally, and I think a set of changes in kind of community or civic life that has like created this Overton window to open.
Hmm.
Now, once you're starting to do policy, that can have an interaction effect with culture and with kind of community life for good or for bad. Oftentimes it is for bad, which is like worth naming.
Yep.
Um, but there is a role for policy to play. And what I kind of saw last year is getting pulled into some conversations with policymakers who were kind of newly engaged around this issue. They were recognizing that like the thing underneath the thing in American life, whether it be like democratic backsliding, economic immobility, kind of deaths of despair and premature mortality outcomes, was the weakening of our social lives and the weakening of our civic lives. And they were trying to figure out what to do. But
Hmm.
it's this is not a new area of policy making. Like people have thought about
Right.
this before.
Yep.
We have like waves of people thinking about communitarianism, but it's a reemergent area, and it's also a very like people argue about what these words mean all the time. Like no one knows what agrees on what social capital means. No one agrees on what social connection means,
Hmm.
and so it feels squishy. It feels hard to kind of like define clearly, and it feels underdeveloped. And so a lot of these policymakers didn't know where to begin. And so
Right.
what this policy framework was really focused on is like how do we provide a actionable, organized, and principled starting point for policymakers to start thinking about in a cohesive, informed way what is the role of policy in strengthening connection and community. And so that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And part of what I like about the way it's set up, and it's very practically oriented, and you're also thinking about, I think sometimes maybe we're talking about a national problem, so immediately some of us might immediately think, oh, okay, there are national policy solutions,
Yeah.
but I know you kind of break it down at sort of all the levels of policy
Yeah, I
making.
just to that point, I think there's like any document, I think there's stuff, or like any document that hopefully is worthwhile. There's stuff for everyone to disagree with, right? So, like, I think there's some folks who are on the left who would really disagree with the approach that I suggest is that like there needs to be more of a localism. Like the people closest to the problem are going to be best positioned to solve those problems. There needs like for the highly educated folks who want to design the perfect technocratic solution, like this is
Mhm.
not something that you're going to design a perfect technocratic solution for. Like the answer to alienation is not more experts telling you what to do. It's inviting people in and drawing on like small d democracy, small d kind of democratic participation. And so
Mhm.
that is very much a key here. But there's also gonna be people on the right who like think like, if we just have more, if we just let businesses do more of their thing and like allow for more prosperity and economic development, we'll solve this problem. And like that, we also take the view that no, like sometimes the market like the market forces can play a negative role in connection. And speaking to what I was talking about around scheduling and around kind of the things that in ways that like we've given so much power to corporations that people have lost agency to control their day-to-day lives.
Mhm.
But that may not be very amenable to folks on the right or some folks on the right. And so, in this framework, it really is thinking about um, community and like local government as the primary locus of
Mhm.
influence, in addition to, and in some ways, kind of responding to kind of community practitioners and civic life, right?
Yep.
But it's not going to be big, capital P federal policy that is going to, help people make friends.
Right, right. That would be a
So
tough bill to write.
yeah, but I mean, people have tried, and I think that it shows the degree to which this challenges how folks think about policy compared to something like healthcare, compared to housing, or things that
Mhm.
are more kind of materialist and kind of like in their existing silos.
Right, right. Well, one thing I love about the resource you put together is, I feel like sometimes there's a ton of information there, but I feel like sometimes you get a report or something, you feel like either gonna read the executive summary and then they're like, oh my goodness, when am I gonna get around to reading the rest of it? But it looks like you set it up, it seems like you could read it and utilize it at many different levels. But you want to explain to the listeners who are obviously not looking, or maybe maybe if they want to check out, you want to let them know where it is on the web, but maybe a little bit about how you structured the resource and organized it.
Yeah, so that's I appreciate this, and I definitely encourage people to check it out directly. We to your point, we structured it kind of like a choose your own adventure. If you're
Yeah.
interested in housing, go to the housing section. If you're interested in early childhood, go to the early childhood section. Um, but the way that we needed to break this down, I think it goes back to this kind of organized piece and this actionable piece that I talked about earlier. So we wanted to take this really, really broad subject, right, that could
Mm.
be everything and anything, and
Yep.
make it accessible, break it down into its bite-sized pieces. And so what we did there was create 4 chapters.
Yep.
That the first one's kind of foundational changes. So think about like what are the kind of uh, shifts that need to happen within government to even have the infrastructure, the foundation in place to maybe approach policymaking focused on strengthening connection or strengthening social capital. So that talks about measurements, that talks about um, like the role of personnel. It also talks about like kind of this connection lens, so how you apply the strategy and kind of operationalize it within government. Then we think about, okay, there is a certain set of institutions that are within communities. So these community institutions that very much shape our experience of participation and connection in communities. So
Yep.
we broke that into 3 sections: one on housing and neighborhoods, one on civic infrastructure and associational life as an institution in and of itself, and then one on these kind of borderline institutions, a part community, part apart from community, which are care and education. Then we think about like actually there's also a element here of like life transitions, are these moments where we can like incredible potential for connection and participation, but also incredible peril because we're oftentimes getting disconnected from a past way of being, a past social network, things along those lines. And so we have a section on like 4 key life transitions that we see policy playing a role around. So early childhood and parenting, the adult transition between kind of high school and then going into adulthood, um, community integration. So this experience of entering or re-entering a community anew, and specifically focusing on veterans, immigrants, and formerly incarcerated people, and then retirement and the older adult years as the final key life transition. And then the
Mhm.
last section of it, and this is like the organization, the last section focuses on enabling conditions. And so what we mean by that is these forces that are technically operating outside of community, but like have a outsized influence of our experience of connection within communities. And so that's really thinking about work, which we've been talking about, as well as kind of our like media and news ecosystem, and
Mhm.
both from a big tech and media and also a local news and media perspective. And so that's how we try to start to make sense and
Yeah.
organize. And then we make it actionable by basically each single section is broken down by the level of government and philanthropy that can kind of take action. So local, state, federal, and philanthropy. And then within that, we include specific policy opportunities that can actually be immediately acted upon, and then case studies or examples of what those look like in
Yep.
practice. And so the hope is that we've taken this really big thing,
Hmm.
we've made it accessible and digestible, and then we've made it actionable, and then people start. You just start somewhere. And I
Yeah.
think my frame, and I'll pause after this, but I think the frame I've been sharing with a lot of folks is like, this is, whether you want to use a baseball analogy and call it the first inning of a nine
Yeah.
inning game, or like just saying it's a starting point and not an end point, but it is something that very much needs to be built upon. But it was kind of putting a stake in the ground and say, hey, here's a way that we can start thinking about this. And by the way, we encourage you to challenge it, to build upon it, and to kind of take it from here.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it definitely fits, I think, the way we roll it as an organization. My own take, it's like, let's find something, find a place to start based on where you are, where you sit, and what you can do. So, yeah, let's talk about a few examples. I know you had mentioned when we spoke before that you were just on a call with a bunch of housing folks. That's certainly an interesting area, and a phrase that's jumped out at me, you were talking about how housing can be designed to be a place of connection, and bridging, not sorting, which I thought was interesting. And that word sorting came up quite a bit in the tool. So maybe speak to the housing a little bit and how that could change to support more social connection and maybe
Yeah.
getting at that sorting issue.
So housing's one of these areas that I think has both uh, very high potential for shaping our lives and community, because like where we live fundamentally dictates who we interact with, the places we go, the relationships we form. And at the same time, it is this moment right now of bipartisan policy agreement that something needs to change given the
Right.
housing affordability and supply crisis. And so, kind of what I key in on in the framework is right now the focus is almost exclusively on the material. It's on increasing affordability and increasing supply. And I think that's good. But I think then if you take the next step, does this change? Will this change lead to more participation, connection in communities? And the answer is no, not if there's not other things in addition to that. And so, this section of the policy framework looks at specific policies to boost more mixed income communities and having more, middle housing, social housing, things like that, that allow for less sorting in communities overall, which is a really exciting opportunity in and of itself. But then it goes into like, okay, if we have more mixed income communities, what needs to happen to kind of activate those communities to then become, or neighborhoods to become, avenues of participation connection? And that section really focuses in on how we can think of neighborhoods as this platform for participation. So it talks about things like neighborhood captains or neighborhood leaderships who are kind of
Mhm.
residents of those neighborhoods who help coordinate activities in those places. It talks about like specific programming that could be done to kind of bring those neighborhoods to life, whether it be block parties or barbecues or
Mhm.
neighborhood dinners,
Right.
or sports leagues and violence interruption programming or block betterment initiatives. Um, and it basically gets to this point of saying like, hey, we can actually see government and philanthropy creating these enabling conditions through micro grants that aren't about getting people, like aren't offering programming in and of themselves, but are like setting the table for people once they move into or living in community together to be able to connect with one another in their neighborhoods and to cooperate and to kind of build that trust and those bonds.
Yeah, that's great. I like the way so you're combining need that policy. Obviously, we need more housing built, but building it alone is certainly not going to create community, but that intentionality of designing those opportunities
Yeah.
around it is
And
great.
it's just elevating that, right? It's just saying,
Yeah.
hey, this is it's a great example of like what I hope one of the so what's for this is like you can think of everything in American life. And I have to give credit to my friend Pete Davis on this. He talks a lot about this. But like every sector, like housing or education, could just have its own field within it that's focused on social connection or social capital, right? And so
Right,
if you
right.
this is basically, the crew within who's focused on housing who also thinks we need to think about the role of housing in strengthening social capital, and that more supply and more affordability alone will not necessarily create the conditions for the good life in communities.
Yeah. You mentioned education and the link to social capital. I think that sometimes we come at it from the perspective of, and certainly evidence to show neighborhoods, schools with higher social capital are going to fare better. Students are going to fare better. But I'm gathering from your take on it too, you're also thinking about it the other way. How does the educational system help generate more connectivity? Is that correct? Or am I?
I think it's a yes and
Yeah.
right. I think it goes in both directions. I think there's in the educational system, there are like lots of things that are already being done,
Hmm.
right? Like I think schools in many ways think about this a lot, but I think there's ways that you can go like within the school day, what are the things that you can do to bolster connection among students? And so like how do you build like create like a sense of identity and skills around building relationships around being a neighbor. This is kind of similar
Yep.
to what making caring common and Rick Weisbord at Harvard talk a lot about. But then also like within schools, how do you facilitate that mixing so it's not just like kind of the more well-off kids who are in the advanced placement classes and like the less well-off kids who are on a different track. So how do you create opportunities for mixing during the day through different structures? There's within schools, it's like thinking about the role of extracurriculars, like what happens
Hmm.
tied to school but outside of schools, and how do you make extracurriculars more accessible by getting rid of these pay to play programs that essentially reduce participation among lower income kids? How do you kind of leverage extracurriculars to be avenues for connection between schools? So like why
Yeah.
can't there be between school extracurriculars where like a rural school
Hmm.
and urban school in an area have a joint musical together? And then there's
Yep.
like how do you lower the barriers between schools and their communities and build that like linking social capital? So the
Hmm.
sustainable community schools model that brings in neighbors to be coaches and mentors and instructors and actually builds those relationships between the neighborhood and the schools, or honestly just seeing schools as an avenue to build relationships among parents and not just through a PTA where you're fundraising, but actually building clubs for parents tied to supporting their kids in their classes. And so that's just the start, and schools do a ton. And oftentimes too much is put on schools, which
Yeah.
is very
True.
real. But it's kind of trying to take this from, this is just something for education to solve versus like education is a piece of this broader puzzle. And actually, the way that schools build connection is deeply related to the way our kind of housing and neighborhoods build connection with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. That example of, getting the cross school, activities going. Just we serve sort of greater Boston, so both the
Yeah.
city proper and some of the more suburban communities. So we're trying to lean into that a little more and more kind of bridging kind of activities. We have this
Mhm.
youth pitch contest where kids are working in their community on a community project, but they come together for a big event where they present their ideas. And there's just so much. They love the opportunity to really connect and share. They share an interest in social change type stuff, and it's so fun. Like, in fact, it was funny. They had this we have this judging process. They get a certain amount of grant awards based on their presentation. Our judges were taking long, and I was like the guy. I was just like trying to make time, and I did have a couple activities planned, but I just started doing more things where they like mixed around the room, and they just love that opportunity to connect. And so we're actually thinking about how to build more of that into the programming, because there
Yeah.
aren't a lot of spaces for that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, and kids, I mean, I can speak from my own experience, and I think like kids yearn for that. Like they want to connect
Yeah.
with kids from other schools. They want to see what life is like on the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, I know we could talk all day about the report,
Yeah.
but I hopefully we've whet people's a appetite, and they will get into it and check it out. But I do have a few more questions for you that
Yeah.
are, building on it. So, all right, in case you didn't know, we have a presidential election coming up soon. So, next president gets elected, we'll sort of be apolitical here, and you are asked, they hear about your framework, and they want one idea that somebody coming into office in January 2025 could do, that level could make a difference on this as part of their
Yeah, it's
100
interesting.
days or whatever. What would it be?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because like I do think the level of intervention here is more like federal support and
Hmm.
local kind of locally driven. I
Yeah.
think there I'm going to answer this with one actually super practical thing that I think either administration should do, and then I'm going to one more aspirational thing. So the super practical thing is the White House a lot of people don't know this, has an Office of Neighborhood and Faith-Based Partnerships. It was started
Oh
in the
yeah.
Bush administration,
Hmm.
and its job originally was to like do the work of supporting and strengthening kind of local groups in neighborhoods, both religious and non-religious groups, and support them. And over time, it's shifted from that more coordinating effort in the Domestic Policy Council that has offices in the 9 major departments. It could do that interagency coordination, and it could do that kind of
Hmm.
intergovernmental coordination to lower levels of government and with civil society. It went from that more ambitious office to one that's
Hmm.
much more narrowly focused on like legalistic church state issues.
Oh yeah.
And I'm not saying that you should not have that narrow focus, but it strikes me as a piece of existing infrastructure that we don't even need to change, that we can just like repurpose to realize its initial mission of strengthening, kind of supporting and strengthening neighborhood groups, community groups to be in service of supporting social capital in their communities. And so that's a very tactical thing that I think
Yeah.
um, either administration, though the Trump administration got rid of the office altogether last time, so I'm not optimistic on that.
Right.
But either administration should do. Then there's something that's more ambitious, and it kind of gets at this college divide piece that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
I think it's impossible to look at the college divide and not actually look at this period of the adult transition as something that has fundamentally changed and fundamentally shifted the way that we experience relationships throughout the life course. And if you think about what's happened like now, the adult transition was created in a national sense with World War II and the standing military, right? And
Right.
basically, the majority of men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s ended up serving in that military. So this, though it still had real issues with segregation by race, it was a remarkably kind of cross-class, cross-geography, collective experience of the adult transition that stayed with people in terms of their relationships and habits of participation throughout
Yeah.
their lives. That basically has been replaced as a key anchor of the adult transition by 4-year colleges. The military kind of shifted to an all-volunteer force in 1973. Now less than 1% of the population serves in the military at any given time. That is the only other structured experience of the adult transition aside from college. And 4-year colleges are almost exclusively the domain of upper middle class kids, right? And this is
Hmm.
something that Bob Putnam wrote about in Our Kids, something that Richard Reeves wrote about in Dream Hoarders. And so what we've done is we've created this great sorting machine during the adult transition, where if you go to college or you're the small 1% that joins the military, you have this collective experience. You're able to build these relationships, and these relationships stick with you after. If you don't go, we don't have any alternative structure for the adult transition. We don't have post-secondary vocational training initiatives that are structured. We don't have um, we don't have a structured kind of cohort-based experience of community college or other 2-year colleges because you're working, you're doing other stuff in addition,
Right.
or you're just joining the workforce altogether. And so it's a long tee up, but I want to say, like, there's a real opportunity to build shared experiences at the adult transition. And right
Yeah.
now, there is momentum at the state level that I focus on around state level service years that are happening in Maryland and are happening in California, where the goal is to get a plurality of graduating high school seniors to do a year of service um, during that period of the adult transition. And they built cohort-based experiences to connect with one another and have that experience. The federal government can come in, and it's not national public service. This is something that's failed many times, but they can come in and help provide the funding, convening, coordination power for more of these kind of state level service years to
Hmm.
happen. And this is something that, Wes Moore has gotten a lot of attention around in Maryland
Yeah.
that Republican governors are also very interested in. And you could actually imagine in 10 to 15 years with sufficient funding and kind of continued learning that we can have a completely different adult transition that lessens this divide in our relational lives with service as one of the main things. And this is a different way of thinking about it than the past national public service pushes, which conservatives were in some ways rightly concerned about because it was kind of top down. It was potentially a lot
Yeah.
of funding. This could emerge from within states, but then be supported through federal investment and federal coordination. And so that is my kind of like other kind of more aspirational thing.
Yeah.
Will that happen? I don't think it's at the top of anyone's agenda, but that is one thing that federal can play a role around.
Yeah. And as these state initiatives gain more traction and show some evidence. Maybe it's not right away, but one could see
Keep it
it
on the
spreading.
radar. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the hope.
One question, do you know about any of those? I agree. I mean, I think it has, I mean, we're part of the AmeriCorps program and there's federal, but I do think that idea of, I totally agree that transitional time is a good time for it. Um, One thing I found with AmeriCorps is sometimes, and it's part for, I think, political reasons, the focus gets so much on the output of that service, how many trails were cleared, how many
Yeah.
kids were tutored, which is important, but for it to be a transformative thing for our democracy, our communities, I think service does have to have really focus on, the learning experience, the community building experience, and I see you nodding, so I assume you agree to some extent. Do you know if any of those models are like how if they're incorporating that, whether it's the Maryland program or you reference some
Yeah,
others?
incorporating it from what perspective? From a program design perspective, from a
Yeah, just
measurement.
because you sort of alluded to the idea that they ought to, design things really intentionally building cohorts, maybe getting them
Yeah.
planning, kind of having it be intentionally thinking about where am I in my life, where, kind of that sort of life plan. You're kind of suggesting a real kind of reflective and educational component to it, I think, ideally. And I was curious if
Yeah.
any of these programs were building that in.
I I think what Maryland builds in well, and this was part of, the prioritization of Governor Moore's administration, is actually this cohort-based experience, where you may be serving in a place, but then you're coming together on a consistent basis with other members of your cohort to kind of reflect on it, to build relationships, to do that type of work. They also partner with a Baltimore-based group called Thread, which is like focused specifically on building social capital in Baltimore through kind of a youth development angle.
Right.
But Thread is doing trainings on like kind of connecting across difference and kind of some of these things that we're talking about. And so yes, that is being built into Maryland. I think this is a real loss if we only talk about this from a workforce lens, or if we
Yeah.
only talk about this from a material lens, because the real potential, though, like I think the hook of having benefits to go to college after, or go to like a vocational training program after, is great. Like I think you want to have those incentives. I think not just thinking about this as like something to check a box, but actually something that can be a really transformative experience for people in the adult transition, particularly people who um, prefer all people across difference, and people who wouldn't have had these experiences otherwise.
Right.
Um, it's this one area that feels like it can affect all these other areas.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Great. Well, assuming, everybody's going to read the report and start taking actions, if they haven't already, and, we're decades, I don't know what the right lens is. You said we're in the first inning. If we got further out, the eighth or ninth inning, couple, a generation ahead maybe is the right time frame. Say look out 20 or 30 years and some of these things a lot of these things have been implemented. What does America look like? In
Mm.
terms of what do American communities look like specifically? I guess that's what we're talking about.
I mean, it's both. Yeah, the the promise of America's communities is constantly expanding the bounds of who belongs in our communities, right? And I think our fatal, or our kind of initial sin, was having really narrowly bounded communities, and our kind of line of progress has been expanding who belongs, and who we view as deserving of our kind of care, our commitments. And I
Hmm.
think that, like, that is a trajectory I see us on. I think people oftentimes talk about like Martin Luther King as this like triumph of rights, but actually like Martin Luther King's success was a triumph of community, and we kind of forgot that. Like he
Yeah.
built his entire vision on lots and lots of meetings, lots and lots of organizing, and like this vision of what a beloved community can be. And
Right.
so I think it's worth situating this as like, the kind, I don't want to say this. The journey of progress as defined narrowly by rights is only half of the story. It's also a journey of progress as defined by the kind of expansion of community,
Mm.
and who is deserving of being in a kind of pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class community. And I think so. What does the 50 years from now look like? It really looks like a place, a space where no matter whether you're going to college or not, no matter what race you are or not, no matter where you were born in the country or not, you have the opportunity to be embedded in the relationships, in the kind of communities and groups, and in the commitments that are essential for to holding us in place to like uncover what it is to live a good life,
Mhm.
and and where no one feels like they should be going through life alone. And this is happening with a sense of agency, with a sense of I feel like I am discovering my agency within community. It's not being done for me. And
Mhm.
if we do that, we're also renewing what it means to kind of build our democracy together and to co-create our democracy together. So I think that's the vision. And I don't, it's almost like not the it's not for me to fully architect, but I
Sure.
think I this it's feeling of embeddedness, it's a feeling of belonging, it's a feeling of appealing to our higher angels of kind of recognizing our promise is like expanding that the bounds of that belonging.
Yeah, well, that's a great vision. And if somebody's listening, they're excited about it. Maybe they're not an elected official. They don't have a big foundation, maybe average, average American, if there's such a thing. And if you were to sum up, if you know something any individual listening to this show could do, if you have parting advice for the average listener.
I mean, so specifically within the framework, I've said this with a lot of folks, like there's stuff here that government like that is maybe oriented towards government, but like you could also just do. Like we have, government should have welcome kits for newcomers, right? Like a community member could just start building a welcome kit. Someone read a newsletter I wrote on that, and now there are communities building welcome kits for people.
Excellent.
Community like there's so much stuff in here that you can do without government. And I would say like if you read this and see inspiration that you want to host a block party, host a block party. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing here is just like consistency, right? It's like the consistency of our commitments. And
Mm.
we're in a moment right now. You and I talked about this on our prep call. We're in a moment where people are thinking about this where they weren't thinking about it 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yep.
There's going to be another moment where we're not thinking about this again. And so it's
Mhm.
like, even when it's not something that's in the cultural zeitgeist, what's important is that like we just continue to show up and we continue to kind of do this work of co-creation, of cultivation of community, um in ways as simple as just kind of showing up on a Saturday or a Sunday, in ways as simple as checking in on others, but also in ways that are like continually pushing kind of to the point of this conversation, the structures to ensure that like the people who have been left on their own are not left on their own. And
Yep.
that's a real call to accompaniment.
Yeah, that's great. Great advice to end with. And so they should, next steps, people should, if they haven't gotten to connective tissue, they should get there on the
Yeah.
web. And are there any other, points of intersection? I think you're having some, depending on when people are listening to this, you're having some calls or something people can join. Is there any other points of intersection,
Yeah, so if you
social
go,
channels where you're active, that sort of thing?
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm sure you'll put this in the show notes, but like the connective tissue .us is where the where you can see everything on the framework, and we have throughout October, we've had a few of these opening calls. We have some like other kind of launch events that folks can join. We have a newsletter where we're continuing to put stuff out on
Great.
this. And then just reach out. I mean, if you hear this and you're interested, reach out to me. I'm just taking conversations with folks. Would love to meet you. So
Excellent. Well, that's a
that's
great
yeah.
offer. Sam, so much great information. Love the report and love your passion for the subject. It's contagious.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.